The town thought her free. Worthless horse was a mistake. Until he uncovered a secret buried beneath her barn that changed everything. For years, Evelyn Hart struggled alone on a dying farm, until the day her worthless rescue horse refused to move from a single crack in the barn floor. What she found beneath it didn't just save her life. It shook the entire town to its core. The Montana evening had a way of sinking slowly into the bones, soft, gold, unbearably quiet. Evelyn Hart pushed the barn door open with her shoulder, the hinges letting out a tired sigh. The last light of day spilled through the gaps in the wood, painting thin amber lines across the straw-covered floor. The air was cool, edged with the faded scent of hay and the sharper note of old pine. She paused on the threshold, allowing her eyes to adjust, but the shape waiting in the corner required no searching. Rust was standing exactly where she had left him an hour earlier. Still as stone, head lowered, his single clear eye fixed on something at his hooves. His other eye, clouded like a winter morning, caught the slanted light and gave him an almost ghost-like presence. For a moment, Evelyn thought he hadn't moved at all since morning, as though he'd been locked in the same breath, the same thought, refusing to be shifted by time or hunger. "Rust?" she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. He didn't lift his head, didn't turn. He simply breathed, long, low, intent, as if the floor itself were whispering secrets up through the old wooden planks. Evelyn felt that familiar stir of worry tighten in her chest. She crossed the stall, boots brushing through last season's straw, knees protesting the long day. When she reached him, she rested a cautious hand against his neck. His coat was cool, almost cold, like he had been bracing against something unseen. "What are you looking at, boy?" she murmured. Rust shifted his weight, just slightly, enough for the boards beneath him to creak. Then his hoof came down with a soft, deliberate tap, a hollow tap. Evelyn's head snapped down. She lowered herself onto one knee, ignoring the way the cold boards pressed through her jeans. A thin line, barely more than a splinter in the wood, ran in a jagged path beneath Rust's hoof, dark, narrow, unremarkable to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But Rust had been staring at it all day. She touched it with the tip of her finger. The wood felt colder there, almost damp. She pressed harder. Nothing shifted, nothing cracked, nothing revealed itself. And yet there was something unsettling in that faint chill, a kind of quiet that didn't belong in a barn like this. Rust exhaled through his nose, a soft, urgent sound, nudging her shoulder gently. She looked up at him, surprised by the sudden closeness. This horse barely let anyone touch him, least of all her. But now he stood over her protectively, as if urging her to see what he saw, or hear what he heard. "You're scaring me a little," she said, her voice cracking into a laugh that wasn't quite a laugh. The barn hummed with silence. Outside, the horizon was sliding from gold to blue, a line of cold shadow creeping toward the fields. Evelyn straightened slowly, brushing dust from her palms. She had lived here for nearly 3 years now. 3 long, uncertain years trying to save a property she barely understood, trying to rebuild a life that had fallen apart faster than she could gather its broken pieces. Every corner of this barn, every acre of this land, carried the weight of family history she couldn't escape. Her parents had poured their lives into this place, dreaming it would one day bring comfort or security. But dreams don't pay debts, and the bank didn't take sentiment as collateral. She looked at Rust again. Of all the things she'd inherited, debt, isolation, a house that needed more repairs than she could afford, it was this horse she had chosen. Or maybe he had chosen her. She wasn't sure anymore. The moon began to lift behind the ridge, pale and cold, shining a silver edge over Rust's frame. His ears flicked toward the floor again. He tapped his hoof once more. Hollow. Empty. As though something beneath them was waiting. Evelyn knelt again, pressing her ear closer to the crack. No sound. No wind. Just the faint smell of earth where there shouldn't be earth. A quiet fear slid along her spine. Not a fear of danger, but of the unknown. Of the countless things buried in old land and in older families. People talked about rural property value, land rights, long-term investment, and the kind of financial security that came from owning acreage in Montana. But none of those things felt real to Evelyn. Not here, not now, not with this mysterious line in the floor that Rust refused to leave. "You want me to understand," she whispered. Rust lowered his head until his breath warmed her cheek. A soft thump of his hoof answered her. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the barn breathe around her. Then she stood up, brushing dirt from her hands, and looked at Rust as though seeing him for the first time. "I don't know what you found," she said quietly, "but I'll look. Tomorrow. I promise." Rust blinked, a slow, deliberate blink, almost human in its patience. Evelyn slid the stall door closed behind her. As she stepped into the evening air, the last light dipped behind the mountains, leaving the barn in a bluish hush. She looked back once more. Rust had resumed his position, head low, one ear turned toward the floor. Waiting. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter around herself and began the walk toward the farmhouse, unaware that the crack beneath the dust was already beginning to change her life. She did not hear Rust tap his hoof one last time behind her, soft, hollow, insistent. Evelyn barely slept that night. The wind moved across the valley in long, unbroken waves, brushing against the farmhouse like a memory she couldn't lock out. She lay awake beneath an old quilt, listening to the wooden walls creak in the cold. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Rust's single clear eye catching the thin beam of sunset, fixed not on her, but on something beneath the barn floor. It followed her into her dreams. Quiet, patient, insistent. By dawn, she felt the weight of fatigue behind her eyes, the kind that comes from years, not hours. She rose slowly, greeted by the sharp chill of a Montana morning. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and the lemon soap she used to scrub the counters the night before. She wondered, not for the first time, why she still kept this place spotless when no one visited anymore. Maybe keeping the farmhouse clean made the rest of her life feel less broken than it really was. She sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a warm mug, trying to steady herself. The old clock on the wall ticked with the stubborn rhythm of something determined to keep going, even when no one asked it to. She understood the feeling. The past few years had reshaped her in quiet, merciless ways, losing her teaching job, the unraveling of her marriage, the sudden silence of a house once full of laughter. At 35, she'd never expected to know so much about starting over. The farm had been her parents' dream, not hers. But grief has a way of returning us to the places we tried to outrun. She inherited the land after both her parents passed, a stretch of earth filled with memories she hadn't been ready to face then. She wasn't sure she was ready now. Still, she came back, because she had nowhere else left to go. A soft buzzing broke the morning stillness. Her phone vibrated across the table. Another message from the bank, reminding her of overdue payments and upcoming deadlines. Words like financial planning, loan restructuring, life insurance policies, and home value review blinked across the screen with polite coldness. She let the message fade without opening it. She couldn't face those numbers before sunrise. Instead, she looked out the window at the barn, its roofline jagged, its boards weathered from years of hard winters. The sky above it was painted with pale streaks of pink and violet. Rust was in there, waiting. She felt it deep in her chest, an unspoken pull, gentle but unyielding. By mid-morning, she finally made her way across the frosted yard. Her boots cracked the thin layer of ice clinging to the grass. She moved slower today, her muscles stiff from yesterday's worry, her mind still fogged. When she reached the barn, she hesitated with her hand on the door, unsure whether she wanted answers or silence. Inside, Rust was exactly where she'd left him. His head lifted when she entered, ears pricking forward at the sound of her footsteps. If he had slept at all, he didn't show it. There was something in his posture, a quiet vigilance, not fear. He turned slightly, revealing that scarred profile and the clouded eye that made him look both ancient and enduring. There was no aggression, only purpose. "Morning," she whispered, as if he might shatter the moment if she spoke too loudly. She moved toward him, the dust rising in thin columns around her boots. Rust shifted a few inches to the side, revealing the crack again. The same faint line she had traced the night before. Light from the open door fell across it, highlighting the uneven edge. She knelt, pulling a nail from her pocket. She'd brought it to test the wood, convinced she would find nothing. But when she pressed the nail into the seam, the tip slid down farther than she expected. Too far. Rust lowered his head and nudged her shoulder again. Soft, but direct. "I know," she murmured. "I came back." She pressed harder this time. The wood did not bend or splinter, but beneath it was an empty space, a space in a barn that should have been solid from corner to corner. Evelyn sat back on her heels, staring at the line. The wind outside shifted, rattling the loose panels on the western wall, sending a thin trail of dust drifting through the slanted light. This barn had been here longer than she'd been alive, older even than her parents. Her father once told her the foundation was built by her great-grandfather, a man she never met, a man who chased dreams through the mountains and left stories behind in the soil. She never believed the stories. Not until now. Rust's breath warmed her neck. She looked up at him, aware of how close he was, closer than he had ever allowed himself before. His single, clear eye reflected her with startling calm. Not pleading, not fearful, just waiting. "You really want me to find out what's under there?" she said softly. Rust didn't move. The silence between them felt almost like agreement. Evelyn stood, wiping dust from her palms. The barn looked different now, not the collapsing burden she had been fighting to maintain, but something alive, holding its breath. She felt the air shift with a sense she couldn't name. She walked to the back wall, where her father had stored his old tools, untouched for years. She brushed cobwebs aside, fingers settling on a crowbar with a handle worn smooth by decades of use. It felt heavy in her hands, almost foreign, but somehow right. She turned back toward Rust, his ears flicked toward her. His stance was still, grounded, as though he'd been waiting for this moment far longer than she had. "All right," she whispered, gripping the crowbar. "Let's see what you've been trying to tell me." She moved back toward the cracked boards, the crowbar balanced in her hand, unaware that the next few minutes were about to shift her life in ways she could not imagine. Rust exhaled, a warm, steady breath, and stepped aside, giving her space, giving her permission. For a long moment, Evelyn stood in the center of the barn, the crowbar hanging loosely in her hand, her breath visible in the cold morning air. Rust stood beside her, his body angled just enough to keep one eye on her and the other on the crack in the floor, as if he were guarding both. The barn was quiet, save for the soft movement of the wind slipping through gaps in the boards. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. It felt expectant. She tightened her grip and knelt again, fitting the thin end of the crowbar into the seam. Rust shifted his weight and stepped back, giving her space. The wood resisted her first attempt, stiff from years of winter storms and summers of heat. But on her second try, the crowbar slid down just a touch too smoothly, and Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. Something was beneath the boards, something hollow, hidden, and old. "All right," she murmured. "Let's see what you've been trying to show me." But before she could push down, a sharp whistle from outside sliced through the barn's stillness. She froze. Rust's ears snapped forward. The barn door swung wide open, sunlight flooding in around a wide shadow in the entrance. "Evelyn Hart," a voice boomed, carrying the tone of someone who believed the world owed him attention. "I figured I'd find you out here." Evelyn stood slowly, brushing dust from her knees. She didn't have to squint to know the silhouette. Broad shoulders, hat tilted low, boots polished in a way that didn't fit working men in Gallatin County. Harlan Cobb, the man who'd practically shoved Rust at her during the auction 2 weeks earlier. He stepped inside like he owned the place, eyes scanning the barn as if appraising it, not with nostalgia, but with the cold precision of someone thinking about home equity and property tax assessments. A salesman's eyes, a predator's smile. Rust took one step closer to Evelyn. "Well," Harlan said, tipping his hat with a grin slicker than oil, "looks like you and that—" He waved a dismissive hand at Rust. "Charity case are settling right in." Evelyn didn't respond. She moved slightly so Rust's shoulder aligned with her own. The horse held steady, unflinching. His clouded eye reflected Harlan without warmth. Harlan chuckled. "Don't look at me like that. He was worthless, Evelyn. Everyone at the auction house knew it. I did you a favor, letting you haul him away for free." She felt Rust's breath on her arm. Steady, grounding. Something inside her settled. She wasn't the same woman who'd stood at that auction trembling with uncertainty. She wasn't sure who she was becoming. But Rust made her feel less alone in the question. "What do you want, Harlan?" she asked, her tone quiet but edged with something firmer than she had intended. "Oh, nothing much," he said, strolling casually through the barn. "Heard the bank's talking about changing mortgage rates again. Tough time to be holding land you can't afford." His eyes skimmed Rust's stall, then the crowbar, then the spot. On the floor she'd been kneeling over. "Thought maybe you'd be needing help. Advice. Maybe even a buyer." Rust's head lifted, nostrils flaring. Evelyn didn't answer. She just followed Harlan's eyes, realizing too late that he hadn't come here for small talk. He was scouting, looking for weakness, for opportunity. Men like him always were. Harlan clicked his tongue. "You know, most folks wouldn't be caught dead taking on a horse like that. Busted leg, bad eye, means trouble, no value." He turned back to her with a smirk. Amazing how folks with nothing still manage to make life harder for themselves. Rust stepped forward, hoof thudding firmly on the ground. Evelyn touched his neck, not to restrain him, but to steady herself. The line in the floor seemed to pulse in the corner of her vision, like a secret waiting to breathe. "Harlan," she said, "you should go." He raised an eyebrow. "Touchy this morning, aren't we?" "Now," she added more firmly. He opened his mouth to protest, but something in her posture, some small, newly hardened line, made him adjust his hat and back toward the door. "All right then," he said, "but don't say I didn't offer help when things get tough. Folks around here know the difference between stubbornness and strength." He paused at the threshold, eyes sweeping Rust once more with disdain. "You hold on to that useless animal, Evelyn. See how far it gets you." Then he stepped out into the daylight, boots crunching across the gravel as the door fell shut behind him. For several seconds, Evelyn didn't move. The barn swallowed the light. Rust let out a low rumble of breath and lowered his head to her shoulder, almost as if apologizing for Harlan's words, or for something deeper he knew she didn't yet. "It's all right," she whispered. "He doesn't know you." Rust nudged her softly. She turned back to the floor, crowbar still lying where she'd dropped it. Harlan's interruption had shaken her, but the crack was still there, patient as ever. And Rust, still watching, still waiting, took a quiet step closer. "I'm not giving up," she said, almost to herself. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing dust across the barn's threshold, carrying the faint smell of snow from the distant ridge. Evelyn knelt again. Rust lowered his head. She fitted the crowbar to the seam and pushed. And the wood finally began to give. The board lifted with a long, splintered groan, releasing a breath of cold air from below that brushed against Evelyn's hands like something waking after decades of sleep. Dust swirled upward in a pale cloud before settling slowly around her knees. Rust backed up half a step, lowering his head until his nose nearly touched her shoulder, his breath trembling with a quiet urgency she felt more than heard. Evelyn pushed the board aside and leaned closer. A darkness waited beneath the opening. A narrow pocket of space, just deep, enough for air to move through it. She felt the temperature shift again, colder than anything inside the barn, colder even than the winter mornings she remembered from childhood. She touched the edge of the opening with her fingertips. The wood ended sharply, and then there was stone. Smooth, old, unnatural. She swallowed. "There's something here." Rust exhaled sharply, almost a command. Evelyn shifted onto both knees and angled the crowbar again, testing the surrounding boards. The next plank budged easier, as though the first had loosened the grip of the whole section. She lifted another, then another, until the hole widened enough for her to see the outline of what lay beneath. A slab of stone, darker than granite, carved into clean edges that didn't belong in a barn built by her father's hands. A wave of disorientation swept through her, something like recognition, though she could not place it. She had walked this barn thousands of times growing up, sweeping the floor, feeding the horses her parents cared for with quiet pride. Never once had she imagined that beneath the familiar boards lay a buried structure of stone. A soft shiver ran up her spine. Rust paced once, hooves tapping anxiously, then settled near her again, his posture still sharpened with focus. It was the same intensity he'd had the first day she brought him home, when he refused to eat until she'd stood beside him long enough for him to trust her presence. But this time, the tension wasn't fear. It was purpose. Evelyn sat back, wiping dust from her palms. Her heartbeat thudded in the heavy quiet. A fragment of memory surfaced. Her father sitting at this very spot years ago, tapping his boots against the floor, staring into the boards with an expression she hadn't understood then. A tired look, like he was contemplating something he wished he could unsee. Perhaps he had known something was strange about this place. Perhaps he had chosen to ignore it. She leaned forward again. "All right," she whispered. "Just a little more." The barn door rattled in the wind, but didn't open. No voice interrupted her this time. No heavy footsteps, no judgments, no offers disguised as threats, only Rust's steady presence and the faintest hum of winter air beneath the boards. She pried up the last of the loosened planks. Beneath them, the stone slab stretched almost 3 feet across, its surface worn smooth and interrupted by hairline cracks where frost had wedged itself over the decades. She brushed a hand across it. The stone vibrated faintly with the movement of her touch, as if echoing something deep and distant. Rust stepped beside her and lowered his muzzle to the stone. He sniffed once, twice, then struck the ground with his hoof. Hard. The sound rang out loud, resonant, hollow, much deeper than wood, much older. Evelyn flinched at the sharpness of it. "That's impossible," she said under her breath. But the truth was undeniable. There was empty space beneath the stone. Her pulse quickened. She looked toward the tool bench, scanning for anything that could help. Most of her father's old equipment was rusted beyond use, but near the corner was a short-handled sledgehammer buried under coils of baling wire and a cracked metal feed bucket. She pulled it free, feeling the weight settle into her grip. This wasn't how she had planned to spend her day. She had intended to work on fence repairs, check her insurance quotes, maybe call the bank about her rising mortgage rates. But those concerns seemed far away now, muted by the ancient silence waiting beneath her barn. A silence that Rust had somehow understood. She returned to the stone, tightening her grip on the hammer. Rust shifted back just enough to give her room, but stayed close enough that she could feel his presence at her side. "Here goes," she said softly. She brought the hammer down on the stone. The crack echoed through the barn like a shot. Dust leapt into the air, drifting in shimmering sheets as sunlight cut through it. Evelyn froze. Breath caught in her throat. For 2 long seconds, nothing moved. Then she struck again. The stone groaned, not shattering but responding, almost flexing beneath the blow. Rust's ears pricked sharply. He pawed the dirt with a restless energy that vibrated through the stall. Evelyn swung again. This time, a hairline fracture widened across the slab with a gritty whisper. A thin sliver of air escaped from the gap, cold and musty, carrying the faintest scent of damp earth and metal, the kind of smell that didn't belong in a barn at all. Her heart hammered. "There's something under here. Rust, you were right." Rust let out a soft, low sound, something like relief. Evelyn pressed her palm against the widening crack. Beneath it, she felt depth, not just a pocket of air, a room. She looked up at Rust. "How did you know?" But the horse only blinked slowly, as if he had been waiting years to be asked. Evelyn stood, dust rising around her like smoke. She needed help now. Someone who wouldn't laugh. Someone who had memories of this land older than hers. Someone who wouldn't share her discovery with the wrong ears. Only one name came to mind. She wiped her hands, grabbed her coat, and whispered to Rust, "Stay here." I'll be right back. Rust didn't move, didn't blink, didn't question. He simply stood guard over the stone, as if he knew the past was finally ready to surface. The road to Caleb Moore's house wound past the line of cottonwoods that marked the edge of Evelyn's property, their leafless branches scratching gently at the morning sky. She walked quickly, breath rising in faint clouds, coat pulled tight against the cold. The crowbar felt heavy in her hand, but not as heavy as the questions she carried. Behind her, she could almost sense Rust still standing over the broken boards, motionless, guarding that stone slab like a sentinel carved out of patience. The snow from last night had melted into a thin sheen over the gravel path, and each footstep echoed faintly in the quiet. Evelyn wasn't sure how to explain what she had found. How to say that the floor of her barn, a place she had known her entire life, was hiding something older than memory. She worried Caleb would think she was imagining things, or worse, losing herself to the loneliness that had crept deeper into her days since she'd moved back. But she also knew there was no one else she trusted enough to tell. Caleb's house came into view, a modest single-story home with a sagging porch and a chimney that always seemed to be sending up smoke, even when no fire burned inside. He was outside already, stacking firewood with the slow, methodical movements of a man whose joints didn't bend as easily as they once had. When he heard her boots crunching toward him, he straightened with a soft groan and wiped a glove across his forehead. "Morning, Evelyn," he said, voice low and steady. "You're out early." She nodded, catching her breath. "I need your help." Caleb studied her face, the furrow in her brow, the way she held the crowbar as though she wasn't aware it was still in her hand. He set down the log he'd been holding. "What is it?" She tried to speak, but the words tangled. She took a breath. "There's something under my barn." Caleb blinked once, slowly. "Something?" "A stone. A slab," she said. "Bigger than anything that should be there. And hollow underneath." Caleb didn't react with surprise. Instead, he reached for his coat on the porch railing, pulled it on without haste, and nodded toward the path behind her. "Show me." Evelyn hesitated. "You don't want to know more?" "No," he said simply. "We'll know when we see it." They walked back together in silence. The land stretched around them in long, muted shades of brown and gray, winter's touch dulling everything but the mountains rising in the distance. Caleb kept his pace slow, steady, like someone who had learned long ago that rushing did not bring answers any faster. Evelyn found comfort in that. She had spent too many months letting panic dictate her decisions, from estate planning paperwork she hadn't touched, to calls from the bank she hadn't returned. Caleb, however, carried a kind of calm that reminded her of her father. When they reached the barn, the structure loomed darker than before, its boards trembling gently in the wind. Rust stood exactly where she had left him, head lowered to the opening, one ear angled sharply toward the stone. When Caleb stepped inside, the horse lifted his head and watched him with an unwavering gaze. Caleb paused a foot away from Rust. "He's focused." "He hasn't moved," Evelyn said. "Not once." Caleb stepped around her, kneeled by the exposed slab, and laid one palm flat against the stone. He closed his eyes, not dramatically, but with the familiarity of someone, greeting an old truth. After a long moment, he opened them again. "You were right," he said quietly. "This isn't part of your barn." Evelyn released a breath she'd been holding. "Then what is it?" Caleb leaned closer, examining the cracking edges. He tapped the surface with 2 knuckles. The hollow sound rose again, a deep, muted thud that did not belong to solid earth. Rust shifted behind them, breath pushing warm air into the cold space. "This land's older than folks around here like to admit," Caleb said. "Older than your parents, older than mine. Back when your great-grandfather settled here, he built on whatever foundation he found, never asked questions." "But why would there be a room under the barn?" Evelyn asked. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Don't know, but the stone's hand-cut and old. Whoever put it here wasn't hiding something small." The barn seemed to lean in around them, as if listening. Caleb rose to his feet with effort. "We'll need the big tools, picks, ropes, maybe the floor jack from my shed." "You'll help me?" she asked, surprised at the tightness in her voice. Caleb's gaze softened in that quiet, unreadable way of his. "You asked," he said. "That's enough." Rust stepped closer then, nosing Caleb's coat sleeve, as though acknowledging his presence. Caleb rested a hand on the horse's neck, a gesture that Rust accepted without flinching. "He's got a good sense," Caleb murmured. "Animals know things before we do." Evelyn managed a small smile. Everyone else said he was worthless. Caleb shook his head. "Worthless things don't stand watch like this." A gust of wind rattled the barn roof. Caleb looked back at the opening in the floor, then at Evelyn. "Whatever's down there," he said softly. "It's been waiting a long time." Rust lowered his head again, one hoof shifting toward the crack. And Evelyn felt it. The first quiet pulse of something she hadn't felt in years. Possibility. She didn't yet know whether it would save her or destroy everything she had left. But with Caleb beside her and Rust standing guard, she felt less alone than she had since the day she moved back to this forgotten piece of land. Caleb dusted his gloves together. "Let's get started." And for the first time in months, Evelyn didn't feel like she was bracing against life. She felt like she was stepping toward something. Caleb's words lingered in the dust-heavy air as they stepped back into the cold morning light. Evelyn felt the weight of them settle somewhere beneath her ribs. Steady. Grounding. Rust followed them to the barn door, stopping just short of crossing the threshold, as though he understood that his place was to guard the secret they had uncovered. He stood tall in the shadows, one eye bright, one clouded, but both fixed on the dark opening in the floor. Caleb's truck sputtered slightly when he turned the ignition. The old engine, coughing before settling into a low hum. Evelyn slid into the passenger seat, clutching her gloves, the crowbar resting across her knees. The road back to his shed felt longer than usual, stretching past bare fields and wire fences that hummed with the wind. The familiar scenery felt different now, not because the land had changed, but because something beneath it had begun to shift. Caleb drove without speaking, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence she remembered from her childhood, riding with her father on early mornings to check the irrigation pumps. A silence that meant more than words. Trust. Purpose. Presence. When they reached Caleb's shed, he sorted through tools with the care of someone who believed everything had its place, even if that place was buried under 20 years of dust. He picked out a heavier crowbar, a floor jack, 2 headlamps, and a pair of thick work gloves that looked like they'd shaped his hands more than once. Evelyn watched him work, appreciating the quiet confidence in each movement. "You sure you're up for this?" he asked without looking up. "I have to be," she said. "Whatever's under there, I can't ignore it." Caleb nodded, as though he had expected that answer. Old land keeps its stories. Sometimes it waits for the right hands to open them. They returned to the barn, with the tools rattling softly in the truck bed. Rust was exactly where they had left him, unmoving, watchful. Caleb paused at the doorway, studying the horse with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "Never seen one so fixed on a point," he murmured. Evelyn stepped back into the barn, the cold seeping through the floorboards and into her boots. She knelt by the exposed slab again, brushing aside the thin layer of dust that had already settled. The fracture line she'd made earlier cut through the stone like a scar. Caleb crouched opposite her, testing the edge with the end of his crowbar. The stone shifted, just slightly. An invitation. "Help me lift," he said. They worked in a rhythm, prying at the edges until the slab lifted with a deep grinding sound. Beneath it lay more darkness, deeper this time, and a draft of cold air that felt like the exhale of a room sealed away from the world. Dust rose in ghostly spirals around them. Caleb angled his headlamp into the hole. The beam revealed the top of another structure. A support beam, old and rotting, but still holding its shape. Below that, shadows hinted at walls made of stone. Not earth, not wood. Someone had built something down there. "What in the world?" Caleb whispered. Evelyn leaned over, gripping the edge of the barn floor for balance. The air rising from the opening carried a metallic scent, faint but unmistakable. It reminded her of old tools left out in the rain. Iron, frost, something ancient. "Is it a root cellar?" she asked. "Not like any I've seen." Caleb lifted his lamp again. "Root cellars use stone. Sure, but this is carved, purposeful." A knot tightened in Evelyn's stomach. "My dad never said anything about this?" Caleb examined the opening carefully, then began setting up the floor jack to widen the crack. He might not have known, or maybe he knew and figured some stories were better left quiet. The metal of the jack groaned as he adjusted the pressure. Rust paced behind them, hooves tapping the wood with an irregular rhythm. Every few seconds he leaned forward, ears pricked, breath rising in small white clouds. "He's anxious," Evelyn said softly. "He's alert," Caleb corrected. "There's a difference." With one final adjustment, the stone lifted enough for them to see the space below, narrow at first, then opening into a chamber maybe 3 feet deep. The beam of the headlamp caught something reflective, a faint glint, like metal beneath dust. Evelyn's breath hitched. "Is that—" "Can't tell yet," Caleb said. "But whatever it is, it's old, and someone meant for it to stay hidden." He handed her one of the headlamps. She slipped it on, heart thudding. The light cut through the darkness in a narrow line, illuminating details she had never expected to find beneath her family's barn. Chiseled stone, compacted soil, and a faint pattern carved into the far wall. A pattern that didn't belong to any part of the farm she'd ever known. Rust moved closer again, stopping only when the hole was inches from his hooves. He stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring, then let out a low sound, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Evelyn and Caleb both froze. Rust wasn't afraid. He was recognizing something. Caleb finally exhaled, long and slow. "This isn't just a room," he said. "This looks like something your great-grandfather built or found and decided not to talk about." Evelyn's pulse skipped. Why would he hide it? Caleb looked at her with a mixture of concern and wonder. Because sometimes people find things they aren't ready to share. Sometimes things worth a fortune stay buried because talking about them brings trouble. Her breath caught. "A fortune?" "Maybe." Caleb shifted his headlamp again. But even if it's nothing more than old metal or tools, it's still part of your heritage. And heritage has its own kind of value, more than any land appraisal could measure. Rust lifted his hoof and tapped it once against the edge of the opening, the sound echoing deep into the chamber. Evelyn looked at him, and for a moment all the years of loneliness she had carried seemed to fracture, just like the stone beneath her feet. "All right," she whispered. "Let's go deeper." Caleb nodded, tightening his grip on the tools. The chamber below waited, silent and patient, just like Rust. For a long moment, neither Evelyn nor Caleb spoke. They knelt at the edge of the opening, each listening to the stillness below, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. Rust stood above them, one hoof resting near the crack, his posture tense, yet strangely composed. His ears flicked toward the chamber every few seconds, as if he could hear something they could not. Caleb tested the floorboards around the widening gap, making sure the weight would hold. Once satisfied, he tied a rope around one of the support beams, anchoring it with practiced hands. Evelyn watched him work, noticing again how his movements carried decades of experience, quiet, dependable, steady, skills that came not from textbooks, but from a life spent reading the land and all its hidden stories. "We'll go slow," Caleb said. "Just enough to see what we're dealing with." Evelyn nodded, tightening the headlamp against her forehead. Light spilled into the hole in a narrow beam, revealing the carved stones that formed the chamber's walls. The air rising from below carried the smell of damp rock and something faintly metallic, like the underside of a tractor engine left untouched for years. She lowered herself inch by inch, hands gripping the rope, boots searching for footholds along the stone ledges. Caleb steadied the rope from above. Rust watched her every movement, his breath soft and rhythmic, as though matching her descent. When her boots touched the packed earth at the bottom, a chill seeped through the soles and climbed up her legs. She shivered, not from cold alone. The chamber was small, barely large enough for two people to stand side by side. The walls rose unevenly, cut stone layered over older stone, telling a story of additions made by different hands at different times. Designs faintly etched into the far wall caught the beam of her headlamp, patterns that resembled arrows or veins, branching lines carved with purpose. Caleb descended after her, slower but sure-footed. When he reached the ground, he exhaled a low breath. This isn't a root cellar. Not even close. Evelyn aimed her light toward the floor. Dirt and crumbled fragments of wood were scattered across it, and beneath those shards, something square and flat caught the light. "There," she said, pointing. Caleb crouched, brushing aside the debris. A layer of dust lifted in a soft gray cloud, revealing the corner of a metal surface, dark, corroded, heavy. He swept more dirt away, and the full outline of the object began to take shape. It was a chest. Iron-bound, thick, reinforced by wooden slats that had rotted long ago. The lock, rusted nearly black, clung to the latch like a last breath. The chest looked old enough to have outlived its maker. Evelyn felt her heartbeat quicken. She knelt beside Caleb, her fingers trembling lightly before she could make herself lift another handful of earth. "Your great-grandfather," Caleb murmured, "must have known this was here." "But why hide it?" she whispered. Caleb didn't answer right away. He pulled a small pry tool from his belt and wedged it beneath the rusted lock. The metal resisted at first, then surrendered with a brittle snap that echoed through the chamber. Rust's hooves shifted above them in response, the faint thud carrying reassurance rather than alarm. Caleb nodded toward the lid. Go ahead, Evelyn. It's yours. She hesitated. Her father's hands had once touched the boards above this very spot. Her grandfather's stories, half forgotten, had brushed against the edges of her childhood. And now here she was, on the threshold of something they had never spoken aloud. She lifted the lid. A cold draft escaped, carrying the scent of time, earth, metal, and the faint tang of something chemical. Inside, layers of cloth lay folded, brittle and stained by years of darkness. Beneath them were stacks of papers, edges curled and ink faded, the writing delicate and precise. Geological sketches, hand-drawn maps, notes on rock formations and mineral seams, and lying beneath the papers were objects wrapped tightly in oilcloth. Caleb reached for the nearest, unrolling it carefully. A small ingot, dark gray with a faint shimmer, fell into his palm. He turned it under the beam of his headlamp. That's not iron, he said quietly. What is it? Evelyn asked, her voice hushed. He studied the surface, the weight, the density. Could be something from the platinum family, maybe osmium or iridium, hard to say without testing. Evelyn blinked. But those are valuable. Extremely, Caleb said. Their price per ounce beats almost anything. They're used in aerospace, medical tech, things most folks around here never think about. She swallowed, her breath catching on the edges of her chest. Why would he hide something like this? Caleb brushed his thumb over the ingot. Because if outsiders knew he'd found a vein of precious metals, they'd have come for the land. And people who want something bad enough don't always ask politely. Evelyn stared at the chest, at the papers now illuminated in the cross beams of their lamps. Words written in her great-grandfather's hand described mineral density, survey points, elevation markers, details far more precise than anything she'd ever seen in old family ledgers. He had known what the land was worth, and he had left it untouched. Caleb sighed, long and low. Evelyn, this could change everything for you, your whole future, not just the farm. Rust let out a soft whinny above, almost as if responding to Caleb's words. Evelyn felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. For months, she had lived under the shadow of overdue notices, climbing interest, and calls she didn't want to answer. The thought that something beneath her barn floor could alter that reality felt unreal, like standing in the middle of someone else's miracle. This doesn't make sense, she whispered. Why would rust lead me to this? Animals feel things we don't, Caleb said. Magnetic shifts, hollow spaces. Maybe he sensed the metal under here. Or maybe... He looked up toward the opening, where Rust's silhouette framed the dim light. Maybe he just knew you needed to find it. Evelyn brushed her fingers over the edge of the chest, feeling a warmth rise through her, the first hint of hope she had felt in longer than she could remember. A hope not for fortune, but for footing, for a chance to break free of the weight that had been crushing her. We should take some of these papers, Caleb said, gathering the maps. Get someone to test the metal. A real geological survey will tell us exactly what you're sitting on. Could be nothing. Could be, he trailed off, shaking his head. Could be a long-term investment strategy some folks only dream about. Evelyn nodded slowly. Okay. They climbed out of the chamber, one at a time, Caleb lifting the papers carefully, Evelyn carrying the small ingot wrapped in cloth. Rust backed up as they emerged, giving them room, his gaze fixed on the chest below, as though guarding it from the shadows. When Evelyn stepped fully into the barn, Rust moved beside her, pressing his muzzle gently to her shoulder. It wasn't gratitude. It was recognition. As if he had known all along what waited beneath her feet. Rust's warm breath still lingered on Evelyn's shoulder when she stepped into the open air. The sky had darkened into a cold slate blue, clouds drifting low over the ridgeline, as if the mountains themselves were leaning closer, listening. Caleb followed her out of the barn with the rolled papers tucked carefully under his arm, the small ingot wrapped in cloth resting in her pocket, like a heartbeat she hadn't noticed until now. They walked toward the farmhouse without speaking, each lost in separate trails of thought. Rust stood framed in the barn doorway, his silhouette carved against the dim interior, watching them leave with an almost human alertness. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. He had done what he came to do. Inside the kitchen, the old ceiling light flickered for a moment before settling into its usual weak glow. Evelyn cleared a space on the table, brushing aside unopened mail, letters from the bank, notices about loan adjustments, leaflets offering legal consultation for homeowners in distress. They had been nothing but reminders of failure only days ago. Now they felt like background noise, faint and far away. Caleb unrolled the maps carefully, anchoring their corners with coffee mugs and a salt shaker. The paper crackled like brittle leaves, fragile but stubborn. Lines drawn in black ink curled across the pages. Elevation marks, mineral density notes, sketches of the valley as it must have looked nearly a century earlier. Her great-grandfather's handwriting survived as thin scratches, but the precision in his measurements felt strangely modern. Evelyn leaned over the table, letting her fingers hover above the maps without touching them. He mapped the whole ridge, she whispered. And the lower pasture, Caleb added, tapping a circled area with his fingertip. This is where the barn sits now. The deposit he charted. It runs right under your land. A tremor of disbelief rippled through her. She'd inherited this place thinking it was a burden. Weathered fences, aging soil, a home barely clinging to its foundation. But beneath it had always been something else. Something she was never told. Why didn't my father say anything? She asked quietly. Caleb's gaze softened. Maybe he didn't know. Or maybe he knew just enough to stay away. Folks back then weren't eager to chase big discoveries. A find like this could bring attention your family couldn't protect itself against. His voice carried an old caution, the kind that came from decades of watching people lose more than they gained when they reached too far. But when he lifted the ingot again, turning it in his palm, the faint glimmer along the metal's edge betrayed the truth. They couldn't ignore this. You need an expert, Caleb said finally. A real geological analysis. Someone who can tell you if this is a trace deposit or something bigger. Evelyn nodded, though uncertainty curled in her stomach. Do you know anyone? I might, he said. There's a professor at the university who worked with mineral surveys. She won't dismiss you. He reached for her coat. We should go today. Her breath caught. Now? Before the wind carries this news anywhere else. His tone held no urgency, but a quiet understanding of how fast rumors traveled. You want this handled right. For your future. Your property rights. The whole picture. Evelyn folded the maps into a protective stack and slipped the wrapped ingot into her pocket. For a moment she felt the farmhouse blur around her, the sagging counters, the peeling paint, the old calendar still stuck on last month. This home had witnessed her grief, her exhaustion, her fear. Now it was witnessing something she didn't yet know how to claim. Rust watched them from the barn as they drove away, the truck bouncing gently along the gravel. He stood perfectly still until they disappeared down the road, then turned slowly back toward the shadowed opening in the floor, as though ensuring the land remained quiet in their absence. The university building stood tall and sharp against the winter sky, its concrete stairs dusted with frost. Evelyn's heart pounded as she and Caleb walked through the glass doors. Her worn boots felt out of place among polished floors and fluorescent lights. She clutched the wrapped ingot in her pocket like a lifeline. Caleb led her down a hallway lined with display cases, geodes cracked open to show glittering crystal cores, fossils etched with the echoes of creatures long gone. A woman with gray-streaked hair and sharp, perceptive eyes stepped out of an office as they approached. "Dr. Hayes," Caleb greeted her. "We could use your expertise." The professor looked between them, noting the dirt under Caleb's nails, the worry in Evelyn's shoulders. "What did you find?" Evelyn handed her the ingot. Dr. Hayes held it gently, turning it beneath the light. The moment the metal caught a faint, iridescent shimmer, Evelyn saw her expression shift. Just slightly, but unmistakably. Curiosity sharpened into something like shock. "Where did this come from?" she asked, voice lowered. Evelyn swallowed. "My barn." Dr. Hayes blinked once, as if recalibrating her understanding of the world. "This isn't scrap metal, and it's not iron." Her voice grew quieter still. "This looks like a refined platinum group alloy, possibly iridium dominant." Evelyn felt warmth crawl up her neck. "Is that valuable?" Dr. Hayes stared at her. "Iridium is one of the rarest metals on Earth. It's used in aerospace engineering, jet engines, satellites. Precious metals value doesn't even begin to describe it. If there's a natural deposit beneath your land." She paused, exhaling slowly. "It could be worth millions." Caleb nodded once, as if confirming what he had already suspected. Evelyn's breath slipped out in a trembling whisper. Dr. Hayes set the ingot down gently. "I'll run tests, but you need to understand, this isn't something you handle alone. You'll need a financial advisor, a lawyer, maybe environmental experts. And you must keep this quiet until we confirm the findings. People don't stay calm around discoveries like this." Evelyn nodded, though her legs felt strangely unsteady beneath her. As they stepped back outside, winter sunlight glinting off the windshield, Evelyn pressed her hands into her coat pockets, feeling the edges of the maps rustle against her fingers. The world seemed both too large and too fragile at the same time, as though one wrong breath could shatter the thin barrier between her old life and the unimaginable new one waiting just beyond reach. Caleb started the engine. "We'll take this one step at a time." Evelyn stared through the windshield toward the valley where her farm lay unseen, where Rust was waiting with that patient, knowing stillness. "One step at a time," she echoed softly. But the truth was already spreading its roots through her life, quiet, unstoppable, and vast. The drive back from the university felt longer than the journey out. The landscape passed slowly on both sides of the truck, rolling by in muted tones of winter brown and frost-bitten gold. Evelyn watched the mountains in the distance shift their shadows across the valley floor, each passing mile loosening something inside her she didn't realize had been tightly wound for years. Caleb kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, saying little, as though he sensed she needed the silence more than reassurances. By the time they reached the farmhouse, the sun had dipped behind the ridge, leaving only a pale lavender glow stretched across the horizon. The barn stood quietly against the fading light, and Rust's outline appeared in the doorway before the truck even stopped. His ears lifted at the sound of the engine, and he stepped forward, as though greeting them home. Evelyn climbed out slowly, her boots crunching over the frozen soil. Rust approached her with a calm certainty, lowering his head until his forehead touched her chest. She rested a hand on him gently, fingers tracing the warm curve of his neck. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Caleb joined her, carrying the envelope of preliminary notes Dr. Hayes had given them. He glanced at Rust with a quiet nod. "He's been waiting for you." Evelyn exhaled, her breath drifting into the cold air. "Feels like he understands more than we do." "Maybe he does," Caleb replied. They walked toward the house. Inside, Evelyn set the papers on the kitchen table, smoothing the edges with careful hands. The numbers still didn't feel real. Probable density, estimated yield, projected valuation. Dr. Hayes had said nothing definitive yet, but the way her voice softened when she explained the implications had told Evelyn enough. Something enormous lay beneath her land. Something with the power to reshape every corner of her life. She made tea, while Caleb lit the old stove, the small room filling with warmth and the faint scent of mint. For a moment, it felt like years ago, when her mother had stood at the counter humming under her breath, steam fogging the kitchen windows as snowfall collected outside. Evelyn blinked the memory away before it tightened her throat. Caleb settled into the chair across from her. "You need to think ahead," he said gently. "If things go the way they might, folks will come around with questions. Maybe more than questions." Evelyn looked down at her hands. "I don't want this to make me someone I'm not." "It won't," he said, "but it can give you tools, options. You could rebuild the place, fix what's been broken, maybe even help others. Not every blessing is a burden." For the first time that day, Evelyn allowed the thought to fully form, that the fear she'd lived with for so long might finally loosen its grip, that she might be able to create something lasting, something good from what she'd discovered. A charitable foundation, maybe. A rescue. A place where horses like Rust could find safety. A sanctuary for forgotten things, the way Rust had once been handed to her with judgment instead of care. She swallowed. "I want to do something that matters." Caleb smiled gently. "You already are." That evening, she returned to the barn alone. The lantern cast soft, golden light over the dust as she opened Rust's stall. He stepped out quietly, stretching his neck toward her, brushing her sleeve with his muzzle. She led him outside to the pasture, where the last traces of daylight clung to the grass. The cold air was sharp and clean. Rust's breath puffed around them like small clouds, rising and fading in the dark. Evelyn leaned against the fence and watched the valley. It was quiet, untouched, serene. She thought about the generations of her family who had walked this land before her, unaware of the treasure beneath their feet. Maybe they never needed it. Maybe the land had been waiting for someone who needed saving just as much as Rust had. She turned to the horse standing beside her. "I don't know how you knew," she whispered, "but you saved me." Rust lifted his head, his one clear eye reflecting the thin line of moonlight rising behind the ridge. He didn't move away, didn't turn, just stood beside her, sharing the cold, the silence, the moment. It struck her then how rare it was to be understood without words. When she returned inside, she found Caleb already at the door, pulling on his coat. "I should get home," he said. "Storm's coming tonight." She nodded. "Thank you. for everything today. You're not alone in this, he replied. Remember that. And then he left, the truck headlights cutting across the yard before disappearing down the road. The house settled into a deep quiet after that, the kind that made every sound feel heavier. Evelyn walked through the rooms, trailing her hand along the walls, noticing details she'd overlooked for years. The cracks in the paint, the frayed curtain edges, the scuffed hardwood floors. This house had held so many versions of her. The child, the daughter, the young woman running from heartbreak, the one trying desperately to stay afloat. She paused by the window, watching the barn through the glass. Rust had returned to the doorway, his silhouette dark and unwavering. A warmth spread through her chest. Not excitement, not fear, but something steadier. Resolve. She sat at the table and opened the notebook she hadn't touched in months. On the first blank page, she wrote 2 words: Rust Haven. The idea expanded in her mind like breath after a long dive, a place where broken things were given time and space to heal. A rescue built not from charity, but from understanding. Something she could build quietly, without greed or spectacle. A place the valley could be proud of. She imagined the fields restored, the barns repaired, horses grazing in wide, safe pastures. A community encouraged by compassion, supported through community development grants and careful planning. A life with meaning, shaped not by wealth but by choice. She closed the notebook softly. Outside, Rust lifted his head to the wind. Everything was beginning. Snow began to fall just after midnight, soft flakes drifting across the pasture like scattered feathers. Evelyn woke before dawn, unable to explain what stirred her from sleep. The house was still, almost tender in its quiet. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, her boots sinking into the thin layer of powder covering the steps. The world had the muted hush of a new morning wrapped in winter's breath. The barn roof glimmered faintly in the half-light, and Rust stood outside instead of sheltered within, as if he had been waiting for her the entire night. His coat, blue-gray beneath the snow, caught the dim glow of the rising sun. Evelyn walked toward him, the cold brushing her skin in gentle waves. Rust lifted his head, nostrils flaring softly in greeting. "You're up early too," she whispered. Rust stepped closer, pressing his muzzle into her palm with a warmth that seeped through her fingers and spread to her chest. There was no urgency in him today, no tension, only a calmness she hadn't seen before, as though a long-held burden inside him had finally eased. For a moment, Evelyn simply stood with him, letting the stillness settle between them. A stillness that felt like closure. She turned to the barn, pushing the door open. Inside, the fractured boards and the dark opening beneath them remained untouched. The stone slab, the maps, the chest deep below, they all felt like pieces of a different time now, no longer haunting her, but anchoring her future with quiet certainty. She would fill this barn with life again. She would rebuild. She would turn this discovery into something meaningful. She walked back outside, and Rust followed her to the pasture gate. The valley stretched before them, covered in a thin veil of white, the kind that made every ridge and shadow appear softer. The mountains glowed with early morning light, and the silence between them and the world felt sacred. "This place, it's going to change," she said out loud, though she didn't know if she was speaking to Rust or to the land itself. "And I want to honor it the right way." Rust lowered his head, nudging her lightly, his breath warm against her coat sleeve. Evelyn smiled. I know. One step at a time. By midday, the snow had melted enough for her to walk the length of the pasture. She studied each fence line, each old gate hinge, each broken board she would one day replace. She imagined horses grazing under the summer sun, the barn repaired and filled with hay, a refuge standing strong against the winds. A sanctuary for animals that had known hunger, fear, abandonment. A refuge for people, too, perhaps without realizing it. As she reached the center of the field, Rust trotted past her, kicking up soft tufts of snow. His gait, once unsteady from injury, now flowed with new strength. He turned back toward her, his single clear eye catching the sunlight in a way that made him appear almost ethereal. That eye had once held wariness, even pain. Now it held something else. Assurance, steady and quiet. Evelyn ran her gloved hand along the worn fence rail, imagining fresh boards replacing it. She thought of the paperwork she'd sign, the long-term stability she could secure, the estate value she could protect. But there was no rush. None of this needed to happen with urgency or noise. The valley would wait for her. Rust would, too. Later that afternoon, Caleb stopped by again to check on her. He found her in the pasture, Rust grazing nearby. She waved him over, and he leaned against the fence with a soft grunt. You look lighter today, he said. I feel lighter, she replied. Caleb nodded slowly. I'm glad. This land, it's yours to shape now, but you're shaping it with care. That matters. Evelyn glanced toward Rust. He gave me a second chance? Maybe you gave him one too, Caleb said. Funny how life works that way. Rust flicked his ears toward their voices, then returned to his grazing, content. They stood in silence for a long moment, listening to the wind move across the snow. There were no words big enough to capture what the past days had meant. The chest beneath the barn, the maps, the metallic ingot that shifted the course of her life. But none were needed. The truth had settled into her in a way that felt permanent, woven into her bones like warmth from a long fire. Caleb pushed off the fence. You'll have people offering to help once word gets around. Some for the right reasons, some for the wrong. But you've got a good heart, Evelyn. You'll know which is which. She nodded. I'll take it slow. Make decisions that honor this place. That's all you can do, he said. As he left, Rust lifted his head again, watching the truck pull away before returning his gaze to Evelyn. She walked toward him, slipping her hand into his mane, feeling the strength beneath the scars. For the first time since she arrived back in Montana, she didn't feel like she was trying to hold everything together. Instead, she felt like she was standing at the start of something quietly extraordinary. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting golden light across the pasture. Rust lifted his head, his breath forming soft clouds in the cooling air. Evelyn leaned against the fence, letting the moment settle into her. Whatever happens next, she whispered, we face it together. Rust stepped closer, resting his head gently against her shoulder. An answer without a sound. The evening deepened, turning the valley blue. At the edge of the pasture, Rust stood tall, his silhouette cutting against the horizon, calm and steady. For the first time, Evelyn understood. The real treasure wasn't the metal beneath the barn, or the numbers she'd soon hear from experts. It was this moment, this peace, this sense of belonging she'd stopped believing was possible. Rust had seen her before she had seen herself. Rust had known the land before she had trusted it. Rust had waited for her long before she ever returned. And in the stillness of the fading light, Evelyn finally saw what Rust had always known. She was home. If this story touched you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share a simple comment below and let me know what part stayed with you. And if you'd like more quiet, heartfelt stories like this one, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.